Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. Today we're going to look at our third lecture, Reviewing the Literature. You may have seen a literature review in every thesis. It is the lengthiest discussion of a research proposal or dissertation. Normally, a chapter or literature review is placed just after the introduction chapter to provide a context for the proposed study and demonstrate why it is important and timely. The literature review chapter clarifies the relationship between the proposed study and previous work conducted on the topic. In this lecture, we will look at 5 broad aspects of reviewing the literature. First, we will look at what is the literature, followed by what is a literature review. Then we will look at why do we need to review the literature, as well as when is the best time to review the literature. And finally, we will look at how to review the literature. This final part is further divided into finding relevant sources of literature and critical reading of research articles. So, what is the literature in a literature review? It is basically a conversation or dialogue of competing arguments between researchers as they attempt to increase knowledge about a topic. This conversation manifests itself as published research, which is described as the literature on the subject. Therefore, the literature is the collection of books and journal articles, government documents, and other scholarly works you found to be relevant to your research topic. When you survey the literature on a subject, you are trying to identify the major studies that have published to date. Particularly, you try to discern what the studies are saying and how they relate to one another. Now that you know what the literature is, what is a literature review? In essence, a literature review identifies, evaluates, and synthesizes the relevant scholarly work within a particular field of study. It's a piece of writing that highlights how knowledge has evolved within the field, what has already been done, what is generally accepted, what is emerging, and what is the current state of thinking on the topic. In addition, within a PhD thesis, a literature review also identifies a research gap, that is, an unexplored or under-researched areas, and articulates how a particular research addresses this gap. Perhaps you should also know what a literature review is not. A literature review is not just a list or summary of books, articles, texts, or journals. A literature review is not an analytical, opinionated, or argumentative essay. A literature review is also not a compilation of abstract or an annotated bibliography. Rather, it is a review of a collection of research published by accredited scholars and researchers that is relevant to a research question. Now that you know what the literature comprises of and what a literature review is, let's take a look at why do we need to review the literature. According to Etheridge, before you can advance the state of knowledge, you need to know what the state of knowledge is. So, when you survey the literature, you're trying to create your own sense of what is known and what is not known about the subject. In other words, you are educating yourself. When you do this preliminary research, it helps you to generate and refine your research ideas too. You may refer to the previous lecture on this. Besides that, you're also educating your readers to understand the topic. Otherwise, they may be confused or doubtful of your research direction or your model. By conducting a literature review, you demonstrate that your knowledge is current and that you are able to show how your research fits in the broader scheme of knowledge. As mentioned in the last video lecture, ideally, we begin our literature review once we have identified our problem. This is to enable us to know more about the status of knowledge in our research topic and to identify research gaps. You will use your literature review to familiarize yourself with common research questions in the subject, what models are used to answer related research questions, the common empirical methodologies in the field, data sources you may use in your analysis, how to report your results, and how to identify your contribution to understanding of the research question. Let's recap on the purposes of a literature review. As mentioned, we review the literature to know what is already known about your research area so as to avoid repetition. A comprehensive and complete literature review will help to identify important and relevant variables for your research and will also help in the selection and evaluation of appropriate theories, hypotheses, and methods. When we do a literature review, we will be guided on what can be researched further, as most articles offer suggestions of further research. By reviewing the literature, you may also help to develop an analytical framework for your study. And last but not least, in the literature review, specific terms used in the research are defined and explained to provide more clarity to your readers. As mentioned before, one of the purposes of reviewing the literature is to know what is already known about your research so as to avoid repetition. So, what if someone has already done a similar research to yours? Well, if someone has done a similar analysis to yours, explain how your research is different. You can do this by explaining their findings and then following up with what you expect to find in your own research, and then making a comparison. You may also highlight the contributions of your study. Now that would usually be unique. In short, the purpose of a literature review is to establish a theoretical framework for your topic or subject area, to define key terms, definitions, and terminologies that are used in your research, to identify past studies, models, case studies, etc. that support your research topic, and to define and establish your area of study or your research topic. As previously mentioned, a literature review demonstrates that you gained a thorough knowledge of the subject area being studied. Here are some of the questions that a good literature review can answer. What are the key sources of the literature in your research topic? What are the political standpoints, if any, surrounding your research topic? What are the origins and important definitions of the research topic? What are the key theories, concepts, and ideas in this research topic? What are the epistemological grounds for the discipline? How is knowledge on the topic structured and analyzed? What are the major problems that have been addressed up to now? What are the major issues and debates about the research topic? So remember, if you did not come across any of these answers, you may have not done a thorough literature review. So when do we review the literature? With small-scale writing projects, the literature review is likely to be done just once, probably before the writing begins. But with longer projects, such as a dissertation for a PhD degree, certainly the process will tend to be longer and more extended. There are generally 3 stages at which a review of the literature is needed. An early review. An early review is needed to establish the context and rationale for your study and to confirm your choice of research focus, research questions and objectives, as well as methods. Keeping abreast with current and relevant research in your field. As the study period gets longer, you need to make sure that you keep in touch with current, relevant research in your field, which is published during the period of research. Relate your findings with others. As you prepare your final report or thesis, you need to relate your findings to the findings of others and to identify their implications for theory, practice, and research. This can involve further review with perhaps a slightly different focus from that of your initial review. You need to be able to demonstrate that you are aware of current issues and research and to show how your research is relevant within a changing context. But of course, there's not only one way as to when you ought to review your literature. For most research, your literature search will continue throughout your project's life. According to Saunders, the process can be likened to an upward spiral, culminating in the final draft of a written critical literature review. In the initial stage of your literature review, you will start to define the parameters to your research questions and objectives. After generating keywords and conducting your first search, you will have a list of references to authors who have published on these subjects. Once these have been obtained, you can read and evaluate them, record the ideas, and start drafting your review. After the initial research, you will be able to redefine your parameters more precisely and undertake further searches, keeping in mind your research questions and objectives. As your thoughts develop, each subsequent search will be focused more precisely on materials that is likely to be relevant. At the same time, you will probably be refining your research questions and objectives in the light of your readings. Now, let us take a look at how to review the literature. An essential part of literature review is literature search. There are usually two areas that need to be searched. One is the literature relevant to the topic, and two, the literature on research methodology and data collection techniques surrounding the topic. On the right is a visual of the literature search on both topic and methodology and where your research fits in between them. You can see that when you conduct a literature review on your topic, you will be able to gain knowledge on the various definitions, history, key studies, theories, concepts or themes, key questions, and current issues surrounding your topic. Likewise, when you conduct a literature review on the methods or methodology, you'll be able to know the assumptions, debates and arguments, issues, problems, data instruments, research design, validity and reliability, findings, conclusions, and recommendations of past studies in relation to your topic. The knowledge that you obtained from these literature reviews will help you in formulating and clarifying your research topic. This was covered in the last video lecture. Now, where there exists research gaps in either the topic or methodological reviews, this will help to define your research even more. To undertake an effective search of resources and find sufficient literature relevant to your topic, there is a need to plan for the search. First, you need to define your research topic. As you have seen in the previous video lecture, one of the hardest parts of a literature review is to develop a problem statement and the following research questions. You don't want a problem that is so broad that it encompasses too many research areas and cannot be reasonably answered. Nor do you want a problem too narrow that it lacks the depth of a PhD research. So, defining your topic may require an initial review of literature on your topic to get a sense of the scope of your topic. When you have a better sense of the topic, it can help you to focus on your research questions. One way to help you plan your literature search is to define the parameters of your search, the keywords and search terms you intend to use, and the databases or search engines that you intend to use. In specifying your topic or research question, you should think about setting appropriate limits or limitations on the research you are seeking. Limiting, for example, by time, personnel, gender, age, location, or nationality results in a more focused and meaningful research topic. In search preparation and planning, you should also identify the main reference tools for your use and convenience. Among the various options of reference tools are citation managers such as Zotero, Mendeley, and EndNote. Zotero is a free referencing tool that allows you to collect, cite, organize, and share research sources. Mendeley is a tool for reference management and for collaborating and sharing your work, whereas EndNote is a tool for managing and publishing bibliographies, citations, and references. Once you have gathered many literature, you should also think about how you want to organize them into a system that suits your preference. And then you can start to plan the sources to be searched and to start the search. Here is an example of planning your literature search strategy. Before starting your literature search, you need to plan by writing down your search strategy and perhaps discussing it with your supervisor. Among others, this should include the parameters of your search and the keywords or search terms that you intend to use. Let's take a look at the parameters of your search. For most research questions and objectives, you will already have a good idea of which subject matter is going to be relevant. However, you may be less clear about the parameters within which you need to search. One way of starting this is to re-examine your lecture notes and course textbooks in the area of your research question. While re-examining these, you can make a note of subjects that appear most relevant to your research question and the names of the relevant authors. This will be helpful when generating possible keywords later. Look at the example in the first box on your left. Now let's take a look at how to generate your keywords. The identification of keywords or search terms is the most important part of planning your search for relevant literature. Keywords are the basic terms that describe your research questions and objectives and will be used by the search tools when you want to locate literature. Keywords can include the author's surnames, which are identified in the examination of your lecture notes and course textbooks. These keywords can be identified by discussing with your colleagues, initial reading, using dictionaries or the thesaurus, brainstorming, or even by using the relevance trees, which was covered in the previous video. Now you can look at the box on the right for examples of how to generate keywords. We have seen how literature search is an important part of literature review, together with search preparation and planning. So the next element of how to review literature is to find the relevant sources of literature. In searching the literature, you have two options. You can go to physical libraries for hard copies or go on digital libraries for soft copies. As we are in the digital age, most of the libraries in the universities in Malaysia are equipped with online databases. The sources of literature can be divided into two main categories: primary and secondary. Primary literature sources are the first occurrence of a piece of work. They include the following: conference proceedings. These are good sources for a literature review because they are useful in providing the latest research or research that has not been published. They are also helpful in providing information on which people are currently involved in which research areas, and so can be helpful in tracking down other work by the same researchers. Government, corporate, or occasional reports. These are also good sources for a literature review. Many government departments and corporations commission or carry out research. Their published findings can provide a useful source of information depending on your field of study. Theses and dissertations. These can also be a useful source of information. However, there are disadvantages. Firstly, they can be difficult to obtain since they are not always published, but are generally only available from the library shelves or through interlibrary loans. Secondly, the student who carried out the research may not be an experienced researcher, and therefore you might have to treat their findings with more caution than published research. Now let's take a look at secondary literature sources. Secondary literature sources such as books and journals are the subsequent publication of primary literature. These publications are aimed at a much wider audience. They are easier to locate than primary literature as they are better covered by search tools. They include the following: journal articles. These are excellent source for a literature review. They are good especially for up-to-date information. They are frequently used in literature reviews because they offer a relatively concise, up-to-date format for research, and because all reputable journals are refereed or peer-reviewed. That is, editors publish only the most relevant and reliable research that has been reviewed by other experts in the field. Books. Generally, a good source for a literature review are books. Books tend to be less up-to-date as it takes longer for a book to be published than for a journal article. Textbooks are unlikely to be useful for including in your literature review as they are intended for teaching, not for research, but they do offer a good starting point from which to find better, more detailed sources. In reality, however, these categories often overlap with each other. For example, primary literature sources, including conference proceedings, can also appear in journals. Your use of these literature sources will depend on your research questions and objectives, the need for secondary data to answer them, and the time available. For some research projects, you may only use secondary literature. For others, you may need to locate primary literature as well. Most research projects will make the greatest use of secondary literature, so this is where we usually start first, followed by the primary literature. So as a rule, peer-reviewed journal publications are of higher quality. For the academic dissertation, the main source would be journals, because the most up-to-date research and debates will be found in journals. However, in academic research, it is advisable to avoid magazines, websites, and newspaper clippings for the following reasons. Magazines are not a good source for a literature review because they are intended for a general audience. For instance, Time, Us, National Enquirer. They will not be useful in providing the sort of information that you need. Specialized magazines, however, may be more useful. For instance, business magazines for management students. But usually magazines are not useful for your research except as a starting point by providing news or general information about new discoveries, policies, etc. Newspapers. These are also not a good source for a literature review because newspapers are generally intended for a general and not specialized audience. The information they provide will be of no use for your literature review. Journalists are generally not scholars, that is, experts on the topic on which you are writing, and thus newspaper articles are not scholarly sources. Websites are also never a good source for a literature review. The fastest growing source of information is on the internet. It is impossible to characterize the information available, but here are some hints about using electronic sources. 1. Bear in mind that anyone can post information on the internet, so the quality may not be reliable. And 2. The information you find may be intended for a general audience, and so may not be suitable for inclusion in your literature review because the information is usually less detailed and less scholarly. If you are old school, nothing beats the smell and feel of libraries to get your books and sources of literature. At the library, you have ample selections of popular publications and scholarly publications. Popular publications are usually addressed to a general audience and are almost secondary sources of information. For instance, an article in the Time magazine or The Economist summarizes an article originally published in the American Economic Review. Popular publications are great for initial reading to get an overview of what's happening in your field of study. But you should always go to scholarly publications for more detail as they are often addressed to a specialized audience, namely experts in the field. Scholarly publications are often primary sources of information. They contain original publications of research studies. An example of scholarly publication is a journal article published in the American Economic Review. Moving on to digital libraries. Most universities subscribe to journals that are published as well as available online. Journals that are available online are called electronic journals. Electronic search engines are also a good start, such as Google, Bing, and Yahoo. We begin by searching keywords that we have identified earlier in titles or author names. Once we have found the articles, we may link the article's abstract to see if it is worth reading further. In most cases, you will be able to download the full text. Full-text databases provide all the bibliographic details such as authors, title, journal title, date of publication, volume, issue, and page numbers. They also include abstracts of the papers and also have access to the full text of the articles in PDF. Let's take a look at some examples of electronic resources. Articles in economics journals are usually classified according to the GEL classification codes, a system originated by the Journal of Economic Literature. The GEL is a journal that provides critical review of articles on economic issues. The GEL is published quarterly by the American Economic Association. The AEA maintains a searchable databases of citation for articles, books, reviews, dissertations, and working papers classified by GEL codes since 1969. There are 20 primary GEL categories as seen in the list below. Another example is the Journal of Economics Survey by Blackwell Synergy. Besides electronic journals, we can also search for electronic working papers and conference papers through the following websites: the IMF, or International Monetary Fund, the NBER website, or the National Bureau of Economic Research, the MIER website, or Malaysian Institute of Economic Research, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, or ADB, the Research Papers in Economics, or REPEG, universities' working papers, occasional papers, conference papers, as well as central banks and other NGOs' publications. Here are examples of full-text databases: ABI Inform, Blackwell Synergy, EBSCOhost Business Source Premier, EconLit, Emerald, Ingenta Journals, ProQuest, ProQuest Digital Dissertations, Science Direct, and Springer. Here are examples of top scholarly journals in the area of economics: American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Econometrica, Review of Economic Studies, Review of Economics and Statistics, Economic Inquiry, Southern Economic Journal, Eastern Economic Journal, Journal of Urban Economics, Journal of Money, Credit and Banking, the Journal of Economics, Journal of Industrial Economics, Journal of Agricultural Economics, Applied Economics, and Applied Economics Letters. Feel free to look for top journals in your field of study. You may have heard about journal articles being a primary source of literature for academic research. Why is that so? Here I am sharing a general process of how scholarly articles work. Once a researcher has finished writing his or her research paper, the researcher submits the finished article to the editor of a journal. The editor will then ultimately decide on whether to publish or reject the article. But in deciding, the editor relies on 2 or more referees. These are experts who review the manuscript and judge its suitability for publication. This process is called a peer review process. In a peer review process, the referees are peer reviewers. The peer review system exists to validate an academic work, helps to improve the quality of published research, and increases networking possibilities within the research communities. But the peer review system is not without criticisms. Studies have shown that even with peer review, some articles still contain inaccuracies and demonstrate that most rejected papers will go on to be published somewhere else. However, these criticisms should be understood within the context of peer review as a human activity. The occasional errors of peer review are not reasons for abandoning the process altogether. So despite criticisms, peer review is still the only widely accepted method for research validation and has continued successfully with relatively minor changes for some 350 years. So how does the peer review process work? Usually, if the paper is not up to standards, the referees recommend that the editor reject the paper, and the editor complies. The author will then try to improve the paper and sends it to another journal. Sometimes the referee will recommend that the paper be reviewed a second time, after the author has revised his or her paper. The author then revises it and resubmits the paper, and the process begins all over again. Eventually, the referees and editor may agree that the paper should be published. Although far from perfect, the peer review process helps to weed out the worst research, which is rejected and not published. It also helps to improve the papers that are eventually published and match papers to journal by quality. This extensive screening involved in peer review process is the main reason why articles in peer review journals are the best. Another reason why scholarly articles are a primary source of literature is that you get the first-hand account, complete with all the limitations that are sometimes ignored in secondary or general sources. We have learned how to find relevant sources of literature. Now we come to the next part of how to review literature, and that is by critically reading research articles. So what does it mean by being critical when we read research articles? Reading is at the heart of the research process. No matter what kinds of sources and methods you use, you are always reading and interpreting text. Good researchers examine their sources critically and actively. They do not just compile and summarize these research sources in their writing, but use them to create their own ideas and ultimately their own understanding of the topic they are researching. Such an approach means not taking every information given to you at face value, but to investigate, test, and even doubt every claim, every example, every story, and every conclusion. It means not to sit back and let your sources control you, but to engage in active conversation with them and their authors. In order to be a good researcher, one needs to be a critical and an active reader. We will look at the steps on how to read research articles in the subsequent slides. But for now, you need to understand your main objectives of reading the article, and that includes to understand existing knowledge. When you read to understand existing knowledge, it helps you to define your own contributions to the area, to identify gaps or next step in the research area, and to gain knowledge to make interpretations. Besides that, you also read the research articles to understand the methods used, as well as the strengths and weaknesses of those methods. You will usually begin by skimming the article to assess its relevance for your research. You may not need it all, or need only a very basic or general understanding of the subject matter. But if you find the article interesting or need to understand the article in more detail, then you will read it more carefully. But before that, let's take a look at the different types of research or scholarly articles. They can generally be divided into survey articles, theoretical articles, and empirical articles. Survey articles, or also known as review articles, are like literature reviews. They are basically written to bring together and summarize the results or conclusions from multiple original research articles or studies. These types of article will not usually have a methodology section, and they generally have very extensive bibliographies. Then there are theoretical articles, written to contribute to the theoretical foundations of a field of study. In this type of article, an author will draw upon existing research to form a new theory or explore theories in new ways. There are no tests or models involved, and therefore leading to difficult discussions using mathematical reasonings. Then we have the empirical articles, which are normally based on an experiment or study. This type of article will have a methodology section that tells how the research was conducted, a results or discussion section, and usually a conclusion section. In economics, for example, empirical articles are original research articles that involve testing or quantifying a model or theoretical analysis. These are the majority of papers in economics. Here I'm also sharing the usual setup for an empirical research. They normally begin with an introductory section that contains the problem statement, motivation of study, and brief literature review, followed by the analysis of the problem, and then the empirical analysis is shown to test or quantify the analysis, and finally a concluding section to explain the results into context and to develop implications. Here is a quick way to skim a research article. First, you look at the story, or the gist of an article. Normally here you look for the main thesis or statement of the problem, followed by empirical evidence used to support that thesis. To understand the story, you need to identify what is the research question, what is the proposed answer or the thesis, what are the major logical or theoretical reasons for the proposed answer, what empirical evidence is presented, and how does the study relate to prior research. If you want to go on to evaluating the story, it involves more questions, like what major assumptions are made? Are they reasonable? Does the thesis follow from a theoretical or logical analysis? Are the data used to test the analysis adequate? Is the empirical analysis appropriate? Do conclusions follow from the evidence? Is the paper clearly written? Overall, what are the major strengths and weaknesses of the story? In other words, do you believe it? Sometimes it may be difficult to understand a research article, especially if they are laden with technical jargons or mathematical reasonings. In the latter case, you don't have to understand the math, just the point that the math is trying to make. Economic research, for instance, will often use econometric methods. Even if you don't understand the techniques, you can determine if the analysis supports or refutes the theory being tested. In other words, don't get frustrated if you don't follow all the details. As previously mentioned, in order to produce a good literature review, you must show that you have researched and read widely. So the key processes to critically read your research articles involve 4 steps. Step 1 is to read your research articles with a purpose. Step 2 is to evaluate your readings. Step 3 is to summarize, analyze, and organize your readings. And step 4 is to analyze and organize your summaries and notes. We will take a look at each of these steps one by one. Let's take a look at the first step. When you read a research article with a purpose, it helps you to quickly locate, evaluate, and read only the research that matters to your topic. There are generally 2 stages involved. First, you look at the structure of the text, that is, the table of contents, abstract, headings, and subheadings, to see if the text is suitable for your research. If it is not suitable, you move on to the next article. But if the text appears relevant, then the second stage is to read it in depth to find specific research to support your literature review. You must be objective in your reading. Objective here means that you are being truthful and not selective in what you read. Remember, the reason you are reading the article is to be able to give an evaluation and critique of the literature chosen. It is important to not just select the part of the literature that agrees with what you think is right. The second step is to evaluate your readings. What this means is that you want to establish whether or not your readings are relevant to your research topic. Not only that, you also want to make sure that your readings are from credible sources. Here is a checklist to keep in mind when you want to evaluate your readings. Authority, validity, accuracy, objectivity, currency, coverage, location, and final check. Let's take a look at authority first. This mainly refers to who conducted the research. Is the author an authority in their field of study or not? And what evidence is there to support this? You can find information from many sources, for instance, referee journals, company reports. Why is this even an issue? It's because the internet has given people access to huge amounts of information. But while some are valid, some maybe not. So you cannot simply accept all information obtained as valid. For instance, Google. You still need to use it together with the university library. Now moving on to validity. You would want to know, where did the research come from? Is it from a valid source, for instance, an educational institution? Has it been peer-reviewed? Or was it obtained from a website? The IIUM library has access to electronic journals and databases. These contain qualified academic writing, so you can be safely assured of their validity. Then comes accuracy. This is basically, what is the literature about? Is the literature accurate, and how do you know it? One way to find out is to check if the research is referred to in other sources, or is it consistent with other findings. You would also want to know what makes the literature believable. Is the literature from credible sources or not? For this, you can cross-reference with validity just now. As mentioned before, objectivity is important. You need to see if there is any evidence of bias in the article. For instance, would you trust research from a cigarette manufacturer claiming that smoking does not damage your health? Do the statistics shared in the paper match those in other publications? If not, is the argument convincing? Here, you may check its method or research design, for instance. You also need to check if the data is true and if there is other supporting data. You may also need to check on the currency of the article. When is the publication date of the material? Is it likely that more current information is available? Have you found any more recent research that casts doubt upon or refutes the findings of the article? Have you checked for more recent information or research? With the exception of seminal works, it is advisable to have some references that are current. When evaluating your reading, you also need to check on the coverage. Is the information complete? What is the sample size? Is it adequate? Is there any further research that has not been mentioned or deliberately omitted from the findings? You also need to check on the location of the article. In which country was the article based on? Is this location relevant to your research? And when you have considered all of the questions above, ask yourself, what does all of this mean? Remember, you're looking for the strengths and weaknesses in what you have read to produce a critical and a sound literature review. The next step is to summarize, analyze, and organize your readings. It is important that you make notes as you read. Otherwise, you will spend a much longer time trying to remember what each article is about. You should think about including the following in your notes. What are the main points or theories or key issues raised in the article or book? You can summarize the main points the author is making. And you can also take note of any quotes or page references that you think may be good to use in your literature review. In organizing your readings, you need to make sure that you keep track of all bibliographic information, such as author, date, title of book, publisher or journal, page numbers, etc. Take note of the way the author has used the original material. Remember that if you copied the author's verbatim, you need to make sure that you place them in question marks and cite the page number. Several other points when summarizing and analyzing your readings are: what is the author's stated or implied purpose? What conclusion has the author made? And what points support the conclusion? Besides taking down notes of what you read from the articles, it may be useful to write down your own thoughts on or about the reading as well. These are useful when you revisit the notes and use them in your writings later. In organizing your readings, you need to decide which ones fall under bibliography and which ones are to be included in your reference list. A reference list includes the details of all of the resources you have quoted or paraphrased in your research, whereas a bibliography includes details of all of the resources you used to produce your thesis, including those that you did not quote or paraphrase. But note that in the APA style, each reference cited in text must appear in the reference list, and each entry in the reference list must be cited in text. We have come to the last step, which is analyzing and organizing your summaries and notes. Use your summaries and own notes to identify the relationships and any links to the research literature. You should be able to identify similarities and differences between the various authors and the research. Which research agrees and disagrees with each other? What major questions remain unanswered? And what are the possible directions for future research? To organize your research, you can cluster or group similar research items together. That is, what information is similar or different. A useful technique for doing this is to draw a mind map and organize the research into major points under each theme. So you have done all that reading. The last thing you want to do is to forget which points come from each article or who said what. So to get the most of your reading, take lots of notes, including references. Ask yourself about what you read, its value to your topic, methods used, or conclusions. Find the research questions of that article. Identify sources to which you will want to return to later. Be selective. You don't have to read everything, just what's relevant for your research. And don't stop reading. Continue to read even when you're collecting your data and doing your analysis. You never know what you can add onto your research. Recall the search preparation and planning process. You know that a strict management of the search is an essential part of the search for literature relevant to your topic. It's always a good practice to have accurate, consistent, and correct records of what you have read, and as mentioned before, you may use software such as EndNote and Mendeley to assist you in recording references. Remember that a search log has three main functions: to act as your record of activities during the literature review process, to act as data for your dissertation, and to act as a learning resource. Here are some tips. Did you know that the quickest way to find gaps in literature is by looking at the introduction and conclusion of an article? The introduction in every article will always identify its research questions and how they differ from other research, while the conclusion of every article will usually list its weaknesses and areas for further study. Did you also know that you can get many literature just from one source? Electronic search engines like Google, Bing, and Yahoo are a good start. You begin by searching keywords of titles or authors that you have identified in your search preparation and planning. Once you have found an article, you may link the article's abstract to see if it is worth reading further. In most cases, you'll be able to download the full text. From the full text, you may find other related research by using the reference list of the article that you already have. Alternatively, you may use the Social Sciences Citation Index, SSCI, to find later related research from your one source, or use keywords or gel codes from your one source. You may also find one or more key researchers through searching their affiliations and visiting their websites. Did you also know that another strategy to find literature is through review articles? Review articles are a good secondary source as they have comprehensive reference lists. For instance, if you are doing research in the area of economics, you may browse the Journal of Economic Literature and the Journal of Economic Perspectives. A very popular question among PhD students is, how many books and journal articles should I cite in my dissertation? The common response would be, as many as you need. What exactly does that mean? While there are very few hard-set rules regarding this issue, you do need to remember that references are necessary to show that you have carefully reviewed the literature and are now contributing something novel to the academic community. However, the amount of the literature does matter due to perceptions. If you don't have enough references, readers may think that you haven't done enough research into existing literature. But if you have too many references, readers may wonder if you did any original research at all. So what is the right number of resources to cite? Well, there is no absolute answer, but it definitely depends on your area. For social science, aiming between 200 to 300 references would be a prudent reading goal for a doctoral project, with about 2/3 derived from journal articles. In qualitative research papers, you may have fewer references. Anything that you cite in your thesis should be listed in the references section, and anything listed as a reference should have been quoted or paraphrased in the text.